There is a notebook on the table in front of me. It is small enough to fit inside a coat. The leather cover has been handled so many times that it no longer shows a colour, only the oil of hands. My hands. I have kept it since the Low Countries, since Antwerp, since the years when what I wrote in it was prices and routes and the names of men who owed me money and men to whom I owed it. That was a long time ago. The notebook is still the same. What I write in it now is different. I opened it this morning to the page where I record the houses. There are 840 names on these pages, give or take the ones still being counted. Monasteries, priories, friaries, nunneries. I do not write what they are. I write what they hold. Stone, timber, land in acres, silver weight, annual income in pounds, shillings, pence. I have become very good at this kind of writing. The question I asked myself this morning, the one I ask every morning now, is the same question I have been asking since the autumn of 1535. It is not whether the thing is right. I stopped asking that question a long time ago, and the answer I gave myself then was enough to move forward on. The question I ask now is smaller and more honest. Is this still the same thing I thought it was at the beginning? I was not born to this room. The room I was born to was a blacksmith's yard in Putney, a mile west of London on the south bank of the Thames. My father's name was Walter. He worked iron. The smell of that yard, the coal, the water on hot metal, the leather of the bellows, I do not think about it often. When I do, I think of it as another country. A country I left when I was still young enough that leaving seemed like the natural direction for everything to move. I went to France. I went to Italy. I was a merchant's clerk in Florence, then a merchant in my own right in the Low Countries, then a lawyer back in England, then a member of Parliament, then a servant of Cardinal Wolsey. Then, when Wolsey fell and I did not fall with him, which was a thing that required more calculation than I am usually given credit for, I was the king's man. The king's man. I have thought about what those words cost and what they purchased, and whether the accounting was honest, and I have come to no conclusion that satisfies me. But I am still here, and Wolsey is not. That is what the record will say. That Cromwell survived where Wolsey did not. That Cromwell understood the king where Wolsey only served him. That Cromwell was the kind of man who could look at a situation, its pressures, its forces, its people, its direction, and find the line of least resistance that ran through it and call that line policy. I do not disagree. The Valor Ecclesiasticus, the survey of ecclesiastical wealth. We began it in the winter of 1535. My commissioners rode out to every monastery in England and Wales, and they counted. They listed income. They listed debts. They listed land. They listed the comportment of the religious, which is a careful way of writing what they found when they looked more closely than the monks expected anyone to look. Some of what they found was what we went to find. I will not pretend otherwise. I sent men who knew what I needed them to find, and they found it. And the reports they brought back gave Henry what he needed, and gave Parliament what it needed, and gave the legislation what it needed. The Act for the Dissolution of the Lesser Monasteries, 1536. Houses with an annual income below £200. The corrupt ones, the small ones, the ones easiest to argue were already failing their purpose. The argument was not false, not entirely. I have looked at these monasteries. I have ridden through their grounds. I have stood in their churches on weekday mornings and watched a handful of old men move through a liturgy that has been repeated in that space for 300 years. And I have thought about what 300 years of a thing means, whether it means anything. Whether meaning is a thing, I'm still allowed to think about. The ink on the first suppression order was dry before I asked that question. The notebook. I want to talk about the notebook because the notebook is where the work is most honest. In the notebook, I write everything I am told not to think too closely about. Not in code. In plain English. Names of abbots, conditions of surrender, what was given up, what was promised, what was paid as a pension to the prior of this house, what the brothers of that house were told about, where they would go next. I write it in a small, clear hand, and I tell myself that this is record keeping, that this is what an administrator does, that the function of a man in my position is to ensure the machinery runs cleanly, and that clean machinery is itself a kind of moral achievement. I've written that argument so many times in my head that it no longer sounds like an argument. The monks who left the abbeys in 1536, I know some of their names. A prior named William Thirsk at Fountains Abbey, a Solara at Rievaulx, an old man at Whalley in Lancashire who had been there for 40 years and who, when the commissioners arrived, is recorded as saying nothing at all, just standing in the cloister with his hands at his sides. I did not put that in the notebook. Some things I do not write down. There is a thing that people do not understand about serving Henry. They look at him and they see power. They look at me and they see a man who wanted power and chose the instrument of it carefully. That is not wrong, but it is not the whole shape of the thing. Henry is a particular kind of king. He is not a stupid man. He is not a brutal man in the way that brutality is simple, He is a man who believes, in the deepest part of himself, that his desires are the will of God, not by divine right in the theological sense only, but in the more immediate sense that what he wants is also what is right, what is necessary, what history will confirm. He has never, in the years I have known him, experienced a moment where he wanted something and then asked himself whether he should want it. This is not madness. It is a particular kind of intelligence. The intelligence of a man who has never had to hold two contradictory things inside himself and choose between them. I have had to do that every day for 10 years. What he needed, what England needed, what I needed, these three things have never pointed in exactly the same direction at exactly the same time. My function has been to find the angle where all three can be said to align, and for 10 years I have been good enough at that function that we have all, including Henry, been able to proceed as if the alignment were real. The monasteries were a convergence. The theology of it, the break with Rome, the supremacy of the crown in matters ecclesiastical, the argument that the monasteries represented a corrupt allegiance to a foreign authority, was a structure I helped build and believed in, to the degree that a man who is also thinking about land revenue and crown finances can be said to believe in anything completely. The theology was not a lie. The theology was not the whole truth either. August 1537, Cockersand Abbey, Lancashire. I did not go myself. I sent Richard Leighton, who is good at this kind of work. The monks were given 3 days. The furniture was inventoried. The vestments were packed. The church plate was weighed and recorded. The church itself was stripped to its stone, and the stone was left standing because pulling down stone costs money, and Henry does not pay for what he does not have to. What Leighton sent back to me was a list. Property, valuation, names of the religious and their assigned pensions. It is in the notebook. It is 8 lines long. What is not in the notebook is what the abbey looked like when the monks left it, what the building sounded like without them, whether any of the brothers looked back. I have found in the years since then that there are things I know without having seen them. A church emptied of its congregation does not need to be described to be understood. The weight of a room from which the human purpose has been removed. I know that weight without needing Leighton to report it. This is perhaps the most honest thing I can say. I understood what I was doing. I understood it clearly enough that I chose not to go myself. There is a question about men like me that the record never asks. The record asks what we did. It records the acts, the dates, the names, the consequences. It assigns responsibility in the way that legal documents assign responsibility. To the person who signed, to the office that ordered, to the hand that set the process in motion. What it does not ask is what the calculation looked like from the inside. Not the justification. The justification is in the record. It is in every speech I made to Parliament, every letter I wrote to the commissioners, every audience I had with Henry, where I explained the necessity of the work in terms that satisfied him because they were not false. The justification is documented. What is not documented is the hour after. The hour after the first suppression order was sealed. When I walked out of the office at Westminster and the evening was coming in off the Thames and the air smelled of river water and wood smoke. That hour. What a man does with that hour. I walked. I do not walk often. It is not a habit I associate with myself. But that evening I walked west along the river, away from Westminster, and I was aware that the thing I had just set in motion was a thing that could not be reversed. Not by me. Not by anyone. The machinery was in place. The commissioners were appointed. The survey was complete. The act was law. I walked until I could no longer see the buildings I worked in, and then I stopped and stood with the river behind me and the fields of Putney in front of me, which in 1536 were still fields. And I thought about whether what I felt was what I thought it was. I decided it was something else. I have spent the years since then maintaining that decision. The argument I made to myself in 1535, when the work was beginning, was this. England is changing. The change was coming before Henry. It was coming out of Wittenberg, out of every printing press in Europe, out of the plain fact that a church that holds itself above the authority of kings cannot hold itself above the authority of kings indefinitely when the kings have armies and the church has mostly argument. The monasteries were not merely religious institutions, they were political ones. Their allegiance to Rome was not only spiritual, it was structural, it was financial. It was a network of authority that ran parallel to the crown's authority and that, in a moment of sufficient crisis, could be turned against the crown. I believed this. I still believe this. What I did not account for, what the argument, stated clearly and followed to its logical end, does not account for, is the old man standing in the cloister at Whalley with his hands at his sides. The argument has no line for him. He is not in the calculation. He was never in the calculation. He is in the notebook now, in the form of a pension amount beside a name. And the pension was a real pension, and it was more than some of these men would have received if they had simply been left to age in the houses they had lived in for 40 years. That is also true. There are many things that are also true. I want to say something about Henry, and then I will not say any more about Henry, because more than this becomes a thing I am not willing to commit to paper. The king is not unaware of what is happening. He is not a man who signs documents without understanding them. He understands every document I have put before him. He has read the reports from the commissioners. He has seen the inventories. He knows that 840 houses of the religious life of England have been reduced, systematically, over 4 years, to a list of assets transferred to the Crown. He does not appear to be troubled by this. I am not saying he should be. I am saying that the weight of the work, the moral weight, the human weight, the weight of the old man at Whalley, and the weight of the church at Cockersand, and the weight of what it costs to turn a living institution into a line item, that weight lands differently depending on where you stand in relation to the Act. Henry stands at the top of it. He signed the Acts. He received the revenues. He stands above the machinery. I am the machinery. That is also a thing the record does not quite capture. Tower of London. The night before. I'm going to tell you something that is not in any document. I do not know, even now, whether the work I did was wrong. I know it was consequential. I know it remade England in ways that cannot be undone. I know that men like me, and there have been men like me in every court, in every century, men who understood the machinery and kept it running and took the instructions from above and turned them into action. I know that men like me are the ones who make the history that is later called by other names. Necessary, inevitable, the tide of the age. I know that I was not the only force in the room. I know that Henry would have found another man if I had refused, and that other man might have done it more brutally, less carefully, without the pensions and the inventories and the careful records of what was taken and where it went. I know that argument. I have used it before. The notebook is on the table in front of me. It is smaller than I remember it being in Antwerp, in the years when I was a merchant, and the worst thing I wrote in it was the name of a debtor who could not pay. The leather has gone the colour of nothing. The oil of my hands is in it. There are 840 names in this notebook, give or take. I have not counted them again. I am not going to count them again. But I know, in the way that you know things you have carried long enough that they stop feeling like knowledge and start feeling like anatomy. I know that if I opened it to any page at all, and put my finger on a line, I would find something the verdict left out. Not innocence, not guilt, something more honest than either. A name, an amount. The record of a thing that happened in a room where no one who would later write the verdict was present. I have kept this notebook since Antwerp. I will not be keeping it much longer. The question I asked myself at the beginning, the one about whether this is still the same thing I thought it was, I am still asking it. That is the most honest thing I can tell you. I am still asking it.